The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as Ibrahim Traoré adjusted his military beret and walked toward the most important meeting of his young presidency. At just 34 years old, the Burkinabe leader had already survived multiple coup attempts and transformed his country's political landscape, but today would test his diplomatic skills like never before. 3 months earlier, Traoré had received an encrypted message through diplomatic channels that would change the course of Burkina Faso's history. The Pakistani government, led by seasoned negotiators and backed by powerful business consortiums, had extended a private invitation for discussions about a massive investment opportunity. The initial figures mentioned were staggering: over $1 billion in potential agreements spanning mining, agriculture, and infrastructure development. Traoré's advisors had been divided on the proposal. Some viewed it with suspicion, remembering how previous African leaders had fallen into debt traps with foreign powers. Others saw it as a golden opportunity to break free from traditional colonial economic ties and forge new partnerships with nations that understood the struggle for independence and development. The young captain had spent weeks studying Pakistan's own development model, learning how the South Asian nation had built its nuclear program, developed its textile industry, and maintained strategic autonomy despite global pressures. He was particularly impressed by Pakistan's experience in managing relationships with both Eastern and Western powers while pursuing its national interests. As Pakistani delegates arrived at the palace, Traoré noticed their approach was different from typical Western diplomatic missions. They came with engineers, agricultural experts, and business leaders rather than just politicians and bureaucrats. The Pakistani delegation was led by a seasoned diplomat who had previously negotiated major deals across Africa and understood the continent's unique challenges. The first day of meetings revealed the scope of Pakistani ambitions in Burkina Faso. They proposed establishing a comprehensive economic partnership that would include gold mining operations, cotton processing, facilities and infrastructure projects including roads, hospitals, and schools. The Pakistani team had done their homework, presenting detailed feasibility studies and environmental impact assessments that addressed many of Burkina Faso's most pressing needs. What struck Traoré most was Pakistan's emphasis on technology transfer and capacity building. Unlike previous foreign investors who simply extracted resources and exported them raw, the Pakistani proposal included training programs for Burkinabe workers, establishment of technical institutes, and gradual transfer of operational control to local management. The negotiations took place in a specially secured wing of the presidential palace, with both sides bringing their most experienced trade negotiators. Traoré personally participated in every session, demonstrating his commitment to ensuring the deal served Burkina Faso's interests. His military background had taught him the importance of understanding every detail of any agreement before committing to it. Pakistani negotiators presented their country's success stories from similar partnerships across Asia and Africa. They showed how Pakistani companies had helped develop infrastructure in countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and several African nations while maintaining mutually beneficial relationships. They emphasized their understanding of working in challenging security environments, given Pakistan's own experience with regional conflicts. The discussions extended beyond mere business transactions. Both leaders shared their visions for South-South cooperation, discussing how developing nations could support each other's growth without relying solely on traditional Western powers. Traoré was particularly interested in Pakistan's experience with maintaining strategic autonomy while engaging with global powers. Security concerns dominated much of the preliminary discussions. Burkina Faso was dealing with ongoing threats from various militant groups, and any major investment would require comprehensive security arrangements. The Pakistani delegation, drawing from their country's extensive experience with security challenges, proposed innovative solutions including private security partnerships and community-based protection programs. By the end of the first week, both sides had identified areas of mutual interest and potential collaboration. The Pakistani team was impressed by Traoré's direct approach and his deep understanding of his country's resource potential. They recognized that despite his youth, the Burkinabe leader possessed the political will and strategic vision necessary to implement large-scale development projects. Traoré, meanwhile, was encouraged by Pakistan's willingness to engage in genuine partnership rather than the extractive relationships that had characterized much of Burkina Faso's previous foreign economic engagement. The Pakistani approach seemed to offer the possibility of real economic transformation while respecting Burkina Faso's sovereignty and long-term development goals. As the initial meetings concluded, both sides agreed to move forward with detailed negotiations. Technical teams would be established to work through the specifics of various proposed projects, while political leaders would continue high-level discussions about the strategic framework for cooperation. The foundation had been laid for what could become one of the most significant economic partnerships in recent African history. The secrecy surrounding these early discussions was deliberate. Both governments wanted to avoid external pressure or interference while they worked through the complex details of their potential partnership. They had learned from other African countries' experiences that premature publicity about major deals could attract unwanted attention from competing powers and complicate negotiations. As news of the ongoing discussions began to leak through diplomatic channels, regional observers started paying closer attention to this unexpected partnership between a West African military leader and a South Asian economic power. The stage was set for negotiations that would reshape not just Burkina Faso's economy, but potentially influence patterns of South-South cooperation across the developing world. The second phase of negotiations took place in a secure compound outside Ouagadougou, away from the prying eyes of foreign intelligence services and rival economic interests. Traoré had chosen this location deliberately, wanting to demonstrate that Burkina Faso was conducting these talks as an equal partner, not as a supplicant seeking aid from a superior power. Pakistani technical experts had arrived with comprehensive geological surveys of Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, including detailed assessments of gold deposits that previous colonial-era surveys had either overlooked or deliberately underreported. The revelation that Burkina Faso possessed significantly more mineral wealth than previously known sent shockwaves through the negotiating teams and fundamentally altered the dynamics of the discussions. Traoré's economic advisors were astounded by the Pakistani findings. For decades, international assessments had suggested that Burkina Faso's mineral resources were limited and difficult to extract profitably. The Pakistani surveys, conducted using advanced geological techniques and satellite imaging, painted a completely different picture. They had identified at least 6 major gold deposits and substantial reserves of other valuable minerals, including manganese and zinc. The young president realized that this information gave him tremendous leverage in negotiations. Rather than positioning Burkina Faso as a poor nation seeking investment, he could now approach discussions as the leader of a resource-rich country choosing its development partners. This shift in perspective transformed the entire negotiation strategy. Pakistani negotiators proposed a revolutionary revenue-sharing model that would give Burkina Faso majority ownership of all extracted resources while providing Pakistan with long-term supply agreements at preferential rates. This arrangement was radically different from traditional mining concessions where foreign companies typically retained majority control and most profits. The agricultural component of the deal proved equally transformative. Pakistan's expertise in cotton cultivation and textile manufacturing offered Burkina Faso the opportunity to move beyond exporting raw cotton to developing a complete textile industry. Pakistani companies proposed establishing spinning mills, weaving facilities, and garment manufacturing plants that would employ thousands of Burkinabe workers and add tremendous value to the country's agricultural output. Traoré was particularly excited about the agricultural technology transfer aspects of the agreement. Pakistani experts had developed drought-resistant crop varieties and water-efficient irrigation systems that were perfectly suited to Burkina Faso's climate challenges. These innovations could revolutionize agricultural productivity and help address food security concerns that had plagued the region for generations. The infrastructure development proposals were equally ambitious. Pakistani engineering firms, renowned for their experience in challenging environments, offered to construct a comprehensive transportation network including highways, railways, and airports. They proposed building these projects using a combination of Pakistani expertise and Burkinabe labor, ensuring technology transfer and skills development throughout the construction process. Education emerged as a crucial component of the partnership. Pakistan proposed establishing technical universities and vocational training centers that would prepare Burkinabe workers for jobs in the new industries being created. They offered scholarship programs for Burkinabe students to study in Pakistani universities, particularly in fields like engineering, agriculture, and business management. Healthcare infrastructure was another major element of the proposed agreement. Pakistani medical institutions, which had developed expertise in providing quality healthcare in resource-constrained environments, offered to build hospitals and clinics throughout Burkina Faso. They proposed training programs for Burkinabe, medical professionals, and technology transfer agreements for pharmaceutical manufacturing. The financial structure of the deal was carefully designed to avoid the debt trap scenarios that had affected other African nations. Rather than traditional loans with high interest rates, the Pakistani proposal involved profit-sharing arrangements and equity partnerships that aligned the interests of both countries. Burkina Faso would retain ownership of its resources while Pakistan would benefit from long-term supply agreements and investment returns. Traoré's negotiating team worked tirelessly to ensure that every aspect of the agreement served Burkina Faso's long-term development goals. They insisted on specific timelines for technology transfer, minimum employment quotas for Burkinabe workers, and environmental protection standards that would preserve the country's natural heritage for future generations. Security arrangements were integrated throughout the agreement. Pakistani security firms experienced in protecting infrastructure projects in challenging environments would work alongside Burkinabe security forces to protect the new investments. This cooperation would include training programs and equipment sharing that would strengthen Burkina Faso's overall security capabilities. The telecommunications component of the deal offered to modernize Burkina Faso's communications infrastructure using Pakistani technology and expertise. This included plans for expanding internet access to rural areas, establishing data centers, and developing local technology industries that could serve regional markets. Pakistani negotiators demonstrated remarkable flexibility and understanding of African political dynamics. They recognized that any successful long-term partnership would require genuine mutual benefit and respect for Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Their approach contrasted sharply with previous foreign investment proposals that had focused primarily on resource extraction with minimal local benefit. As negotiations progressed, both sides developed genuine respect for each other's capabilities and perspectives. Traoré was impressed by Pakistan's technical expertise and business acumen, while Pakistani negotiators appreciated the young president's vision and determination to transform his country's economic prospects. The breakthrough came when both sides agreed on a comprehensive framework that addressed every major sector of Burkina Faso's economy, while ensuring that the benefits would be shared equitably. The deal was structured as a long-term partnership rather than a traditional investment agreement, with both countries committed to supporting each other's development goals. Regional implications of the emerging partnership became increasingly apparent as details of the negotiations leaked to neighboring countries. Other West African leaders began expressing interest in similar arrangements with Pakistan, recognizing the potential benefits of South-South cooperation that respected African sovereignty while providing genuine development opportunities. The UPE agreement was taking shape as something unprecedented in modern African economic history, a truly equal partnership between developing nations that could serve as a model for future cooperation between global South countries seeking alternatives to traditional North-South economic relationships. As word of the massive Pakistan-Burkina Faso negotiations spread through diplomatic channels, opposition forces both within and outside the country began mobilizing to derail the agreement. Traoré found himself facing the most intense political pressure of his presidency, as various interest groups recognized that this deal could fundamentally alter regional power dynamics. Traditional opposition politicians, many of whom had ties to former colonial powers, launched a coordinated campaign questioning the wisdom of such extensive cooperation with Pakistan. They raised concerns about debt sustainability, environmental impact, and the potential for Burkina Faso to become overly dependent on a single foreign partner. Their arguments gained traction among some urban intellectuals who worried about trading one form of dependency for another. International pressure intensified as major global powers realized the implications of the emerging partnership. French officials, traditionally dominant in West African economic affairs, expressed private concerns about losing influence in their former colony. They began questioning Pakistani intentions and suggesting that Burkina Faso should be more cautious about partnerships with countries outside the traditional Western sphere of influence. American diplomatic representatives also raised questions about the strategic implications of increased Pakistani presence in West Africa. They worried about potential security risks and suggested that such partnerships might complicate regional counterterrorism efforts. These concerns were quietly communicated to Burkinabe officials through various diplomatic channels. Chinese interests, already established in several West African mining operations, viewed the Pakistani initiative with suspicion. Chinese companies had been positioning themselves for expanded operations in Burkina Faso, and the Pakistani agreement threatened to exclude them from major opportunities. Chinese diplomatic pressure focused on questioning Pakistani technical capabilities and financial reliability. Within Burkina Faso, some traditional chiefs and religious leaders expressed concerns about rapid economic changes that might disrupt established social structures. They worried that large-scale industrial development could undermine traditional livelihoods and create social instability. These concerns were amplified by opposition groups seeking to build broader coalitions against the agreement. International media coverage became increasingly critical as various interested parties fed negative narratives to journalists. Stories appeared questioning Pakistani business practices in other countries, raising environmental concerns about proposed mining operations, and suggesting that Burkina Faso lacked the institutional capacity to manage such complex agreements effectively. Traoré responded to mounting criticism by embarking on a comprehensive public education campaign. He traveled throughout Burkina Faso, holding town halls and community meetings where he explained the details of the proposed partnership and addressed specific concerns raised by citizens. His direct military-style communication resonated with many Burkinabés who appreciated his transparency and accessibility. The young president also invited independent experts to review the proposed agreements and provide public assessments. These reviews, conducted by respected African economists and development specialists, generally supported the partnership, while suggesting specific safeguards to protect Burkina Faso's interests. Their endorsements helped counter opposition narratives about the deal being rushed or inadequately scrutinized. Pakistani officials faced their own domestic criticism from some quarters who questioned the wisdom of such massive investments in politically unstable regions. Conservative politicians in Pakistan argued that the government should focus resources on domestic development rather than risky overseas ventures. However, business communities strongly supported the agreement, recognizing the enormous potential returns from accessing Burkina Faso's resources and markets. Security concerns became a major focus of opposition arguments. Critics pointed to ongoing militant activities in northern Burkina Faso and questioned whether Pakistani investments could be adequately protected. They suggested that the security costs of protecting such extensive operations might exceed the economic benefits, creating an unsustainable burden on government resources. Traoré addressed security concerns by presenting detailed assessments showing how the Pakistani partnership would actually strengthen national security. The increased government revenues from the partnership would fund expanded security operations, while Pakistani security expertise would enhance Burkina Faso's capabilities to address regional threats. He argued that economic development was the best long-term solution to security challenges. Environmental groups raised questions about the environmental impact of proposed mining operations, demanding comprehensive environmental impact assessments and strict regulatory oversight. Traoré welcomed these concerns and insisted that all operations would meet the highest international environmental standards. Pakistani partners agreed to use the most advanced mining technologies to minimize environmental damage. regional competitors, began their own diplomatic offensive to discourage the partnership. Some neighboring countries, influenced by external powers, suggested that Burkina Faso's cooperation with Pakistan might complicate regional integration efforts. They raised concerns about potential trade disruptions and currency complications that might affect regional economic cooperation. Labor unions presented mixed reactions to the proposed partnership. While they welcomed the prospect of thousands of new jobs, they demanded guarantees about working conditions, wage standards, and union representation rights. Traoré worked directly with union leaders to address their concerns and incorporate worker protection clauses into the final agreements. International financial institutions expressed concerns about the unconventional financial structure of the proposed partnership. Traditional development banks were accustomed to controlling development finance in the region and viewed the Pakistani approach as potentially undermining their influence. They raised questions about financial transparency and regulatory compliance that required detailed responses from both governments. Opposition pressure reached its peak when several prominent politicians called for parliamentary hearings on the proposed agreement. They demanded full disclosure of all negotiation details and threatened to organize mass protests if the government proceeded without broader consultation. Traoré agreed to parliamentary scrutiny while maintaining that the executive branch had constitutional authority to negotiate international agreements. The intensity of opposition and international pressure actually strengthened Traoré's resolve to proceed with the partnership. He recognized that such strong resistance from established interests was evidence that the agreement threatened the status quo in ways that could benefit Burkina Faso. The young president became even more determined to complete the deal and demonstrate that African countries could forge independent partnerships that serve their own development goals. Pakistani negotiators were initially surprised by the intensity of opposition, but quickly adapted their strategy to address legitimate concerns while maintaining their core objectives. They provided additional documentation, agreed to enhanced transparency measures, and offered to modify certain aspects of the agreement to address specific concerns raised by various stakeholders. As pressure mounted from multiple directions, both Traoré and his Pakistani counterparts recognized that successfully completing the agreement would require careful management of domestic and international opposition. They developed comprehensive communication strategies designed to build public support, while addressing legitimate concerns and countering unfair criticism from interested parties seeking to preserve their own advantages in the region. The final phase of negotiations took place over 3 intense weeks in a specially constructed conference facility on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Both sides had brought their most experienced legal experts, economists, and technical specialists to work through the remaining details of what had become the largest South-South cooperation agreement in modern African history. Traoré personally supervised every aspect of these crucial final discussions, often working 18-hour days to ensure that Burkina Faso's interests were fully protected. His hands-on approach impressed Pakistani negotiators, who had rarely encountered a head of state so directly involved in complex technical negotiations. The young president's military background had taught him never to delegate critical decisions that could affect his country's future. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult session focused on revenue sharing from mining operations. Pakistani negotiators had initially proposed a 60-40 split in favor of Burkina Faso, which was generous by traditional mining agreement standards. However, Traoré insisted on a 70-30 split, arguing that his country's resources deserved majority benefit sharing. After heated discussions that lasted nearly 2 days, Pakistani negotiators agreed to the higher percentage in exchange for guaranteed long-term supply contracts at competitive prices. Agricultural cooperation emerged as another area requiring careful negotiation. Pakistani agricultural experts had identified opportunities to triple Burkina Faso's cotton production through improved seeds, irrigation systems, and farming techniques. However, they wanted exclusive marketing rights for the increased production. Traoré's team successfully negotiated a compromise where Pakistan would receive preferred supplier status, but Burkina Faso retained the right to sell surplus production to other markets. Technology transfer provisions required extensive legal work to ensure that Burkina Faso would genuinely benefit from Pakistani expertise rather than simply becoming dependent on foreign technical support. Both sides agreed to establish joint technical institutes where Pakistani experts would train Burkinabe engineers, technicians, and managers to eventually operate all facilities independently. These training programs would be funded through the partnership's profits rather than additional loans. The infrastructure development timeline became a major point of contention. Traoré wanted rapid, visible progress to demonstrate the partnership's benefits to his citizens, while Pakistani contractors needed realistic timeframes to ensure quality construction. They eventually agreed on a phased approach that would prioritize high-impact projects like roads and hospitals, while allowing more time for complex facilities like industrial plants and technical institutes. Financial arrangements required innovative solutions to avoid the debt problems that had plagued other African development projects. Pakistani negotiators proposed a unique equity partnership model, where both countries would own shares in joint ventures proportional to their contributions. This structure meant that as projects became profitable, both partners would benefit, rather than Burkina Faso simply paying back loans with interest. Security provisions were carefully crafted to address legitimate concerns while respecting Burkina Faso's sovereignty. Pakistani security firms would provide technical expertise and training to Burkinabe forces, rather than taking direct control of facility protection. This approach would enhance local security capabilities, while ensuring that Pakistani investments were adequately protected. Environmental safeguards became a cornerstone of the final agreement, after extensive input from environmental experts and civil society groups. Both parties committed to using the most advanced mining and industrial technologies to minimize environmental impact. They established joint environmental monitoring committees with authority to suspend operations that violated agreed standards. Labor standards were negotiated in consultation with Burkinabe trade unions and Pakistani labor organizations. The agreement guaranteed that all operations would meet international labor standards, with specific provisions for worker safety, fair wages, and union representation rights. Pakistani companies agreed to prioritize hiring Burkinabe workers and provide comprehensive training programs to develop local expertise. Regional cooperation elements were added to address concerns from neighboring countries about potential trade disruptions. The agreement included provisions for extending certain benefits to other West African countries, particularly in areas like transportation infrastructure and technical education. This regional dimension helped build broader support for the partnership across West Africa. Quality control mechanisms were established to ensure that all construction and manufacturing would meet international standards. Joint inspection teams, with representatives from both countries, would monitor all projects, with authority to require modifications or improvements. This system would protect both Burkina Faso's development goals and Pakistan's international reputation. Dispute resolution procedures were carefully designed to provide fair mechanisms for addressing any conflicts that might arise during implementation. Rather than relying on international arbitration systems that often favored established powers, the agreement created specialized joint commissions with expertise in the specific sectors covered by the partnership. Currency and payment arrangements required sophisticated financial engineering to minimize risks for both parties. The agreement included provisions for payments in multiple currencies, with built-in hedging mechanisms to protect against exchange rate fluctuations. This financial structure would provide stability and predictability for long-term planning on both sides. Intellectual property provisions ensured that Burkina Faso would have access to Pakistani technological innovations while respecting legitimate patent rights. The agreement included technology licensing arrangements that would allow Burkinabe companies to eventually manufacture products independently, rather than remaining permanently dependent on Pakistani suppliers. Transparency and accountability measures were integrated throughout the agreement to address governance concerns raised by various stakeholders. Both governments committed to regular public reporting on project progress, financial performance, and social impact. Independent monitoring committees would provide additional oversight and public accountability. The final agreement comprised over 400 pages of detailed provisions covering every aspect of the partnership. Legal experts from both countries had worked around the clock to ensure that all commitments were precisely defined and legally enforceable. The document represented one of the most comprehensive bilateral cooperation agreements ever negotiated between developing countries. As negotiations concluded, both Traoré and the Pakistani negotiating team recognized that they had created something unprecedented in international relations. The agreement demonstrated that developing countries could forge equal partnerships that respected sovereignty while creating genuine mutual benefits. The success of these negotiations would inspire similar cooperation efforts across the global South. The final signing ceremony was planned as a major diplomatic event that would showcase the new model of South-South cooperation. Invitations were sent to leaders throughout Africa and Asia, along with representatives from international organizations interested in alternative development models. The ceremony would mark not just the completion of negotiations, but the beginning of a new era in Burkina Faso's development and international relations. The signing ceremony took place on a brilliant Tuesday morning at the conference center in Ouagadougou, transformed into a venue befitting one of the most significant diplomatic events in modern African history. Flags of both nations flew side by side as delegations from across Africa, Asia, and the international community gathered to witness what many observers described as a potential turning point in South-South cooperation. Traoré arrived at the ceremony wearing his military uniform, symbolizing the strength and determination that had characterized his approach to these negotiations. At 34, he was about to sign agreements worth over $1 billion that could transform his country's economic trajectory for generations. Pakistani Prime Minister's special representative, a seasoned diplomat with decades of international experience, represented the Pakistani side with equal gravitas and commitment to this historic partnership. The ceremony began with traditional performances from both cultures, highlighting the shared values and common aspirations that had brought these two nations together. Burkinabe drummers and dancers performed alongside Pakistani cultural artists, creating a unique celebration that symbolized the fusion of different traditions in pursuit of common development goals. Before the signing, Traoré delivered a speech that would be remembered as one of the defining moments of his presidency. Speaking in French, Arabic, and English to accommodate the diverse international audience, he explained his vision of African countries taking control of their economic destiny through partnerships based on mutual respect and shared benefit. His words resonated with leaders from across the developing world who had struggled with similar challenges in dealing with traditional economic powers. The Pakistani representative responded with equal eloquence, describing the agreement as a model for how developing nations could support each other's growth while maintaining their sovereignty and cultural identity. He emphasized Pakistan's commitment to genuine partnership rather than exploitation, drawing on his country's own experience as a developing nation that understood the challenges of building modern economies while preserving traditional values. The diario. Actual signing took place in front of hundreds of witnesses, including diplomatic representatives from dozens of countries, business leaders, civil society activists, and international media. Each page of the comprehensive agreement was signed with ceremonial pens that would later be preserved as historic artifacts. The moment captured on camera would become iconic imagery representing a new era in international cooperation. International reactions to the signing were immediate and varied, reflecting the diverse interests and perspectives of the global community. African leaders generally praised the agreement as an example of the kind of partnerships their continent needed to achieve real development. Several presidents and prime ministers issued statements expressing interest in similar arrangements with Pakistan and other developing nations. European reactions were more cautious and sometimes critical. French officials, while publicly maintaining diplomatic courtesy, privately expressed concerns about losing influence in their former colony. They questioned whether Burkina Faso had adequate institutional capacity to manage such complex agreements, and suggested that the deals might create unforeseen complications for regional stability. American responses focused primarily on security implications, with State Department officials expressing hope that the partnership would contribute to regional stability while not complicating ongoing counterterrorism efforts. They emphasize the importance of transparency and good governance in implementing the agreements, reflecting broader American concerns about Chinese and other non-Western influences in Africa. Chinese reactions were particularly interesting, as Beijing had been positioning itself as the primary alternative to Western economic partnerships in Africa. Chinese officials publicly welcomed the agreement, while privately reassessing their own strategies for engaging with West African countries. The Pakistani success demonstrated that China was not the only Asian power capable of forging major partnerships in Africa. International financial institutions initially responded with skepticism, questioning whether the innovative financial structures proposed in the agreement would prove sustainable over time. However, several development economists praised the partnership's emphasis on equity sharing and technology transfer, suggesting it might offer lessons for improving traditional development finance models. Regional reactions within West Africa were overwhelmingly positive, with several neighboring countries immediately expressing interest in similar partnerships. Ghana, Mali, and Niger all sent high-level delegations to the signing ceremony and initiated preliminary discussions about potential Pakistani investments in their countries. The agreement was already catalyzing broader changes in regional economic relationships. Pakistani domestic reactions were equally enthusiastic, with business communities celebrating the opportunity to access new markets and resources. Pakistani stock markets responded positively to news of the agreement, with shares of companies expected to benefit from the partnership experiencing significant gains. The success also boosted the government's domestic standing by demonstrating Pakistan's growing international influence. International media coverage was extensive and generally balanced, with major news outlets recognizing the historic significance of the agreement while raising appropriate questions about implementation challenges. Several major newspapers published editorial analyses discussing the broader implications for South-South cooperation and the changing dynamics of international economic relationships. Academic and policy research institutions immediately began analyzing the agreement as a potential case study for alternative development models. Universities in both Africa and Asia announced new research programs focused on studying the implementation and outcomes of this pioneering partnership. The agreement would likely influence development theory and practice for years to come. Environmental organizations offered cautious support for the agreement, noting the comprehensive environmental safeguards included in the partnership. They committed to monitoring implementation to ensure that environmental promises were kept, while acknowledging that the agreement set higher environmental standards than many traditional development projects. Labor organizations in both countries expressed satisfaction with the worker protection provisions included in the agreement. International labor unions praised the partnership's emphasis on skills development and technology transfer, suggesting it could serve as a model for ensuring that international investments genuinely benefit local workers rather than simply exploiting cheap labor. The signing ceremony concluded with a joint communiqué outlining the implementation timeline and establishing the various committees and oversight bodies that would manage the partnership. Both leaders committed to regular public reporting on progress and welcomed international observation of the partnership's development. As delegations departed Ouagadougou, there was a palpable sense that they had witnessed something unprecedented in international relations. The agreement represented more than just a bilateral partnership. It demonstrated that developing countries could forge their own paths to development through mutual cooperation and shared expertise. The immediate aftermath of the signing saw intense diplomatic activity, as other countries sought to understand the implications of this new model and explore similar opportunities. Pakistani diplomatic missions across Africa reported increased interest from other governments, while Burkina Faso found itself receiving unprecedented attention from international investors and development partners. Within hours of the signing, implementation teams from both countries were already meeting to begin the detailed planning required to turn the ambitious agreements into concrete development projects. The real work of transformation was just beginning, but the foundation had been laid for what could become one of the most successful South-South partnerships in modern history. 6 months after the historic signing ceremony, The first tangible results of the Pakistan-Burkina Faso partnership began appearing across the country. Traoré stood on a hillside, overlooking the construction site of what would become West Africa's most advanced gold processing facility, watching hundreds of workers from both nations collaborating to build the future of Burkina Faso's economy. The implementation had begun even before the international media attention from the signing ceremony had faded. Pakistani technical teams arrived within weeks of the agreement's ratification, bringing with them advanced equipment and decades of experience in developing similar projects in challenging environments. Their first priority was establishing the infrastructure necessary to support the massive development program outlined in the bilateral agreements. Road construction projects had commenced simultaneously at 12 different locations across the country, connecting previously isolated communities to regional markets and creating employment opportunities for thousands of Burkinabe workers. Pakistani engineering firms had brought their expertise in building roads through difficult terrain, while training local workers in advanced construction techniques that would benefit future infrastructure projects. The agricultural transformation was perhaps the most immediately visible impact of the partnership. Pakistani agricultural experts had introduced new cotton varieties that were showing remarkable results in test fields across the country. Early harvests suggested that cotton yields could increase by more than 200%, which would dramatically increase farmer incomes and provide raw materials for the proposed textile manufacturing facilities. Education initiatives were already producing remarkable results as the first group of Burkinabe students had arrived in Pakistan for advanced technical training. These young people, carefully selected from across the country, were studying engineering, agriculture, business management, and other fields critical to implementing the partnership agreements. They would return as the technical leadership for the new industries being established. Pakistani companies had begun operations at 3 different mining sites, employing nearly 5,000 Burkinabe workers in various capacities. The emphasis on technology transfer was evident as Pakistani supervisors worked alongside local trainees, gradually shifting operational responsibility to Burkinabe management. The revenue-sharing agreements were already generating significant income for the government's development programs. Healthcare improvements were becoming visible in communities across the country as Pakistani medical teams helped establish clinics and training programs for local healthcare workers. The first Pakistani-funded hospital was nearing completion in Bobo Dioulasso, equipped with modern medical technology and staffed by a combination of Pakistani specialists and Burkinabe medical professionals. Traoré's government had used the early revenues from the partnership to launch complementary development programs that addressed social needs not directly covered by the Pakistani agreements. New schools were being built in rural areas. Scholarships were provided for promising students, and social support programs were expanded to ensure that the benefits of economic growth reached all segments of society. The success of the initial implementation phase had attracted attention from other international partners who wanted to participate in Burkina Faso's transformation. Several European companies had approached the government with proposals for complementary investments, recognizing that the Pakistani partnership had created a stable foundation for broader economic development. Regional impact was becoming evident as neighboring countries observed the rapid progress in Burkina Faso and sought similar partnerships. Ghana had signed a preliminary agreement with Pakistan for agricultural cooperation, while Mali was negotiating potential mining partnerships. The success was catalyzing broader changes in West African economic relationships and development strategies. Security. Improvements were an unexpected but welcome benefit of the partnership. The increased economic activity and employment opportunities had reduced social tensions in many communities, while the revenue from Pakistani investments allowed the government to expand security operations and improve equipment for military and police forces. Environmental monitoring was proceeding according to the strict standards established in the original agreements. Joint Pakistani-Burkinabe environmental committees were conducting regular inspections of all industrial operations, ensuring compliance with international environmental standards. Several innovative environmental protection measures were being implemented that exceeded the original commitments. The textile industry development was progressing rapidly, with the first spinning mill already producing cotton yarn for both domestic and export markets. Pakistani textile experts were training Burkina Faso workers in all aspects of textile production, from basic spinning to advanced garment manufacturing. These facilities would eventually employ tens of thousands of workers and add tremendous value to the country's cotton production. Financial transparency was being maintained through regular public reports on all aspects of the partnership. Citizens could access detailed information about project progress, employment statistics, and government revenues through public websites and community meetings. This transparency was building public support for the partnership and encouraging similar openness in other government programs. Technology transfer was exceeding expectations as Pakistani partners shared not just equipment, but also the knowledge necessary to maintain and eventually improve upon the systems being installed. Burkina Faso technicians were learning to operate sophisticated mining equipment, agricultural machinery, and industrial facilities that would transform their country's productive capacity. Cultural exchange was flourishing alongside economic cooperation, with Pakistani and Burkina Faso families forming friendships that strengthened the partnership beyond mere business relationships. Cultural festivals, language exchange programs, and student exchanges were creating lasting bonds between the two nations that would sustain cooperation for generations. International recognition of the partnership's success was growing, with several major international organizations studying the model as a potential template for South-South cooperation. The World Bank had sent evaluation teams to assess the innovative financial structures, while the African Development Bank was considering similar approaches for other regional partnerships. Women's empowerment had emerged as an unexpected but significant benefit of the partnership. Many of the new employment opportunities, particularly in textile manufacturing and agricultural processing, were being filled by women who had previously lacked access to formal sector employment. Pakistani partners had specifically prioritized gender-inclusive hiring practices, creating opportunities for thousands of Burkina Faso women to earn independent incomes and gain new skills. Youth engagement was particularly impressive, with over 15,000 young Burkina Faso receiving training in various technical fields through partnership programs. These young people represented the future leadership of their country's transformed economy and were already demonstrating remarkable capabilities in managing complex industrial operations under Pakistani mentorship. The partnership's success had fundamentally altered Burkina Faso's international standing. Traoré found himself invited to international conferences as an expert on South-South cooperation, while his country was increasingly viewed as a model for how African nations could take control of their economic development through strategic partnerships with other developing countries. Looking toward the future, both governments were already discussing expansion of their cooperation into new areas including renewable energy, telecommunications, and advanced manufacturing. The success of the initial agreements had built trust and confidence that enabled even more ambitious planning for the next phase of their partnership. The transformation of Burkina Faso was becoming a symbol of possibility for the entire developing world. Other African leaders were studying the Pakistani model and adapting it to their own circumstances, while Asian countries were exploring similar partnerships across the continent. The agreement had catalyzed a new era of South-South cooperation that was reshaping global development patterns. Economic indicators were already showing remarkable improvements, with GDP growth accelerating beyond all projections and government revenues increasing dramatically. The multiplier effects of the Pakistani investments were creating additional economic activity throughout the country, as local businesses benefited from increased demand for goods and services. Social transformation was equally dramatic, with improved healthcare, education, and employment opportunities creating a sense of optimism and possibility that hadn't existed in Burkina Faso for generations. Citizens were witnessing concrete improvements in their daily lives and developing confidence in their country's ability to build a prosperous future. The partnership had demonstrated that small developing countries could achieve remarkable transformation through strategic cooperation with partners who understood their challenges and shared their aspirations for development. Traoré's vision of economic sovereignty through South-South partnership was becoming reality, inspiring similar efforts across the developing world.